Hello, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, I'll be discussing the cells of the nervous system. There is some basic information that should be reviewed before we dive too deep into this week's topic. And one of them is the periodic table and the elements and ions that are found on the periodic table. Four important ions to know about are potassium, sodium, calcium, and chloride. As you may recall from a high school chemistry class, the uh, elements on the left side of the periodic table, when they appear as ions, they have a positive charge, whereas the elements on the right side of the periodic table, like chloride ions, have a negative charge. The next topic that should be reviewed is the basic components of a cell. So we'll be talking about a special type of animal cells uh, in this video. So it's important to know not all of these parts, but just some of the basics, things like the nucleus, the part of the cell that contains DNA and which is translated into RNA and creates proteins and different channels on the membrane. The cell membrane itself is very important to know, the outer layer of the cell, as well as things like vesicles, things that provide transport for various nutrients and other chemicals that the cell needs. Uh, to take another closer look at the cell membrane, it's important to know that there is a intracellular side and an extracellular side to the cell membrane. So intracellular obviously would be the inside of the cell, and extracellular being the outside of the cell. We'll be referring to those two parts quite often, as well as it's important to know that the cell most cell membranes consist of a phospholipid bilayer. So they have these lipids that are kind of paired in two and form the cell membrane, and that the only way for chemicals to get through the cell membrane is if they travel through some kind of protein, like a membrane channel, like what's pictured here in purple, or if they are small enough, they might be able to go through the lipid bilayer itself. The next important concept to review is the different types of membrane channels that are found in animal cells. So the first type is voltage-gated channels. These are channels that change only when the cell membrane reaches a certain level of voltage, when it reaches a certain level of charge. When it's below that threshold of charge, it's closed, and when it's above that threshold or reaches that threshold, then the channel opens and allows the appropriate chemicals to have their function. And then there are ligand-gated channels, which don't depend on any voltage. They just depend on the binding of a particular chemical to allow them to open. And then there are leaky channels, which just operate via diffusion. They just kind of are always open and let specific ions or molecules go in and out. So hopefully that's a review for most individuals. Those are some important concepts. Feel free to ask me questions if you have any any difficulties with any of those concepts. So there are two types of cells in the nervous system that we'll be talking about. The first type that we'll be spending most of our time on is the neuron. The neuron is a specialized type of animal cell that transmits neural impulses throughout the nervous system. There's approximately 86 billion neurons in the human brain alone. So here's an image that shows the basic structure of a prototypical neuron. Neurons come in all shapes and sizes, but this is kind of the most basic diagram to present what they typically look like throughout the nervous system. So you don't have to know all of these parts of the neuron right now. I'll just point out a few important parts. The first most important part is the cell body, or the soma. And this contains the nucleus, it contains the mitochondria, all the other parts of the animal cell. Then there is the dendrites, which are the branch-like extensions of the cell body, which allow the neuron to communicate with other neurons and receive incoming signals from other neurons. Then there is the axon. The axon is this long extension here that carries the neural impulse from the cell body to the next neuron. And lastly, there is the synaptic terminals, or the axon terminals, also called terminal buttons. They come in many different names. This is a terminal that allows the neuron to communicate with another neuron and pass on the nerve signal. This image is another good image of the structure of a neuron and really shows how a neuron is nothing more than a specialized animal cell. It has all of the same parts within the cell body, all those things that you may have learned in high school biology, like a mitochondrion, the nucleus we mentioned earlier, ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, as well as some specialized functions that we'll discuss in detail in the next video. So in the next video, I'll be talking about the three stages, the three steps of a neural impulse, how neurons go about communicating. And the first stage is describing how the neuron behaves at rest. The second stage is describing how the neuron transmits the nerve impulse within the axon itself. And then the third step is transmitting that neural impulse to another neuron.